Hello everyone and welcome to Geoguessr Deconstructed. Today we are looking at Canada. Canada is the second largest country on Earth in terms of landmass and the 38th most populous with a population of just under 39 million people. In case you are unaware of where Canada is, it is directly north of the United States on the North American continent. In case you don't know what the Canadian flag looks like, it is red with a big maple leaf in the middle. You'll see this infrequently in Canada, probably not as much as you would the US flag, but you do see it occasionally. Canada has 10 provinces and 3 territories, those being British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland Labrador for the provinces. The 3 territories are the Yukon Territory, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. The 3 largest cities in Canada in terms of population are Toronto, which is found in southern Ontario here, Montreal, which is found in southern Quebec, and Vancouver, which is all the way on the west coast in British Columbia, very close to the American border. Canada's country code for their websites is .ca, as you might expect from Canada. You also see things like .com, .org as well, but .ca does pop up occasionally. Canada is effectively fully covered in terms of urban areas and basically areas where people live. As you can see, a lot of the north of these provinces is completely uncovered, but that's mostly just because people don't live there. We also have maybe 1 or 2 roads in Yukon and Northwest Territories, and Nunavut only has a couple towns, which we'll get into later. One important thing to know about Canada in relation to distinguishing it from the US is the use of Gen 2 camera, which, if you're not aware, is when you have this wide circle, pretty distinct wide ring of blur on the bottom of the Google car, and also some at the top. Can't really see it too much here, but you can see the circle. Canada has roughly 8 or 9% of the coverage still as Gen 2, where the US has less than 0.5%, maybe. So if you have a round, if you're not sure if it's Canada or the US, and you see Gen 2, it will more than likely be Canada. That being said, Canada still does have all 4 generations of camera, with Gen 1 being extremely rare and Gen 3 and 4 being the most common. Finally, before we talk about general identification, we can talk about the terrain. So, as you can see, on the west side of the country, the Rocky Mountains dominate most of British Columbia and some of Alberta, as well as the Yukon Territories up in the corner here. The Great Plains extend from a lot of the United States into eastern Alberta and southern Saskatchewan and bits of Manitoba. Because of this, a lot of southern Saskatchewan and places like North and South Dakota look very, very similar. So that's why we have tips later on to help you identify those. But they're also extremely flat. Finally, in terms of significant geographic features, we have the Canadian Shield. That consists of northern Saskatchewan, northern Manitoba, most of Ontario, and most of Quebec, especially where there's coverage. And that can be characterized by lots of exposed rock. If you're on a road and you see a lot of natural rock, you might be in that Canadian Shield section. So let's get into some general identification tips. The federal languages of Canada are English and French. They also use the British way of spelling things. So for example, center is spelled with RE at the end, whereas in the United States, it would be spelled with an ER at the end. French is also an official language, as mentioned, and you can see a lot of both signs exclusively in French. These are especially true in the provinces of Quebec and New Brunswick. Despite French not being technically an official language of some of the provinces like Manitoba or Saskatchewan, you can still see some bilingual signs there, so just because you're seeing French, it doesn't mean you're necessarily in Quebec or New Brunswick. Another way to identify Canada is that it looks a lot like the United States. If you're familiar with what the United States looks like, there's a lot of these single houses, a lot of, I guess, normal looking cars. The license plates are short, which we'll get into later as well for each province. Just typical looking neighborhoods. So it is very easy to get Canada and the United States confused, especially in no move or NMPZ scenarios. One interesting way to tell Canada and the United States apart, which is not seen in too many guides, is only in Gen 3 coverage is the blur of the car. So as you can see here, this is the front of the car, and this is where the mirror would be. In Canada, there's these 2 lumps, as you can see here. These are here blurring out the mirror and potentially a roof rack. I don't really know what the car they use to take the coverage is, but you do see these 2 lumps. You don't see them all the time in Canada, but if you do see them, you're almost guaranteed to be in Canada. Again, this is just the Gen 3 coverage where there is a visible blur. It is on both sides, as you can see. In Gen 4, there is basically no blur, so this is not applicable. So this is the American blur. As you can see, there is just one hump here for the mirror. There is not a second one for a roof rack. So this is actually a pretty good meta, especially if you are in a rural location and don't really know which country you're in. Some other ways to distinguish between Canada and the United States include the single yellow line found in the road. This is, in my research, a little bit less prevalent than it may have used to be. Most of the time, you'll see double yellow lines in Canada, and sometimes you see a single yellow line in the United States. More often than not, if you see a single yellow line, you're going to be in Canada, but not vice versa, so that if you see a double yellow line, you're not guaranteed to be in the US. But it does seem that Canada has more single yellows like this one than the US does. This one's kind of a 2-in-1. The chevrons here, which indicate a curve or just a general turn, are the same as the United States with this black arrow on a yellow background, with the exception of Quebec, as we'll get to later. But Canada likes to use these checkerboard signs that indicate a T-junction. So in this case, we're on a road that splits into 2 more roads. This checkerboard sign with the 2 arrows is only found in Canada. Again, this is different in Quebec, but we will get to that in the Quebec section. One of the easiest ways to determine if you are in Canada or the United States is the presence of this speed limit sign. In Canada, it says maximum and generally has a larger number because they use kilometers per hour. In the United States, it says speed limit. Simple as that. An interesting thing that can be found in Canada is the signs are less wordy. So generally, if you are used to United States signs, you'll have the yield sign with the word yield in it. In this case, this is a railroad crossing sign. So in Canada, there are no words on it, unlike a United States railroad crossing, which has the words railroad crossing on it. As mentioned earlier, Canada uses the metric system, so you'll see distances in kilometers. Finally, for signs, we have this pedestrian crossing sign. It is a white background with a black silhouette of a person, generally a black line on the bottom. This can only be found in Canada, but you won't see this in the US. I'll cover license plates more in the per province and territory section, but generally the license plate is short. It is the same length as a United States plate, but shorter than a European plate. To add on to this, only a handful of provinces require a front plate. These are British Columbia, Manitoba, Ontario, and New Brunswick before 2019. Because some coverage in New Brunswick is going to be before 2019, you may see front plates there. But as always, especially in a country like Canada, cars travel, so you may see a front plate in a province where they typically don't have front plates. So if you're moving especially, check multiple to make sure that you have the right plate. Something else to keep in mind, especially if you're in a more urban area, is the companies that are present. So in this case, McDonald's Canada, which is actually a different company than McDonald's like that you would see everywhere else, their logo has a maple leaf in the arches. You'll also see companies like Tim Hortons more often than you'll see in the US, as well as places that are exclusive to Canada such as Bell, Canadian Tire, and the Canada Post. Canada has really only 2 main interprovincial roads, so those that run between multiple provinces. There's the Trans-Canada Highway, which technically is a highway system, but more often refers to just one route, this being Highway 1. Highway 1 begins in Victoria, which is found on Vancouver Island, navigates up here, ferry into Vancouver, all the way across the country, going through every single province, all the way to St. John's in Newfoundland. The other major road is the Yellowhead Highway. It has the same logo as the 1, or the Trans-Canada Highway, but it is considered Highway 16. It begins on Graham Island, which is found west of British Columbia, travels north through Edmonton and Saskatoon, and ends in Winnipeg. It does not go the full distance like the 1 does, but it still does cover a lot of ground. Like I mentioned, the logo, which can be seen on the map as well, is a green background with a white maple leaf in it, sometimes containing either 1 or 16. There are also other highways in the Trans-Canada Highway system, however these are not interprovincial. So finally, with that all out of the way, let's get into each individual province, starting from the west with British Columbia. As you can see, British Columbia is very, very mountainous. As mentioned before, it basically just sits in the Rocky Mountains, and that is very indicative of the coverage that you can see. There are just mountains everywhere, some snow-capped, some not, but much, much more hilly and mountainous than the rest of the country. British Columbia also has somewhat of a distinct speed sign. So in this case, the km per h is not typically seen in other provinces, with some exceptions, but can be seen in British Columbia. This is not always the case. You may find some that are just maximum 100 in this case. So if you see this km per hour on a white background specifically, you should be in British Columbia. I believe this can also be found in some territories, but generally you can use the rest of the clues around you to deduce British Columbia from that. One main thing that is used in Canada overall is these transformers on the side of some power poles. So as we can see here, in British Columbia, the transformer is kind of facing the road. So it's perpendicular to the pole, like the pole insulators on top. This is seen in British Columbia and New Brunswick. Nova Scotia has a little bit of a different one, which we'll get to later. Being able to distinguish this perpendicular transformer from a parallel transformer, which is in basically the rest of the country, can help distinguish from, say, British Columbia here or Western Alberta, which may also look mountainous. Something that is seen in British Columbia, but not necessarily exclusive to it, is these concrete barriers. These replace guardrails or just having cables with posts every once in a while on bridges and along highways and things like that. You do see this in other territories, but it is very common in British Columbia. Next, we have this bollard, which can be seen. It does look similar to a couple other Canadian bollards, but in this case, there's a pretty distinct rectangle that can be seen, as well as just having these two black bands be pretty far apart. So as we'll see later, the Alberta one, the black bands are a lot closer together than this one is. Next, we have these hanging signs. This is kind of an extreme example with this whole outer triangle part here, but a lot of the time, so like something like this, you have a lot of signs that are hanging off of poles as opposed to mounted on top of them, as you'll see in the rest of the country. This is the province-specific road in British Columbia. As you can see, again, a hanging sign, but it has BC on it. It also has the British Columbia flag, which, if you don't know, is the Union Jack on top, or the Great Britain flag on top, with a big sun and some waves underneath it. It's kind of hard to miss, but if you see BC, you'll also know. This is the blurred representation of a British Columbia license plate. Again, they do use front plates. You really can't see much off of it. This is what it should look like. So basically blue text on a white background, but you really can't make it out too well with the Google Maps blur. So this is not super helpful, as it might be for some other provinces. Moving on to Alberta. So as we saw earlier, Alberta is part of the Great Plains, especially the southeastern part. That means you get terrain like this, which is extremely flat, a lot of long country roads with really not much to see, occasionally some hills, but really not too many. However, the western part of the province is also part of the Rocky Mountains, so you get things like this, which honestly look a lot like British Columbia and would probably trip up a lot of people. Again, we have these concrete barriers like in BC, a lot of other things like that, so you should use your other clues to determine what province you're in. This is a cherry-picked example, and it's extremely close to the British Columbia border, so that's kind of why it looks like British Columbia, but it is still technically Alberta. As mentioned earlier, the Alberta bollard is pretty significant. It does show up very often in the province and has these two black bands. You can see the black band on top goes to the top of the pole, as well as the one underneath having a smaller gap than the one we saw in British Columbia. These are very common in Alberta, like for example, on every corner there's like 4 or 5 of them here. So especially if you're in a very flat country road like this, looking for these is really helpful. A unique aspect of Alberta, especially in the countryside, is the presence of township roads and range roads. These effectively form a grid through the entire province that can easily help you pinpoint where you are. These follow a numerical system, so looking at this graph, which is kind of an eyesore, but bear with me, I'll put a link to this in the description as well. So we can see the township roads increase from south to north, starting at 1, ending at like 150 or even more. And the range roads increment from east to west. The distinction of these is that they reset a couple times, so it won't be a perfect system, but at the very least you'll have the township road, from south to north again, to be able to pinpoint better. How to read this map: you have all the numbers on here, you multiply them by 10, and that's your township road. So in our example earlier, we had the township road of 250 and the range road of 272. So looking at the plot, we go up to 25, which represents 250, go over to 27, in this case is here, and I don't believe there's another 27 here. Yeah, it would be up here, but as the 25 doesn't make sense, we can pinpoint it to just east of the main city border of Calgary, which, if we zoom out of the location, is just about where we are. So this is a pretty good method. Of course, you can also just zoom in on the map and see Township Road 50, Range Road 273, but this will at least get you to a faster starting point to start scanning further. This is an Alberta plate under the Google Maps blur. Again, you really can't tell too much. You can see a bit of a red or some discolored, honestly to me it looks kind of yellow, at the top. This is indicative of the actual plate, where there is red text on a white background. Again, I don't think this is the most useful license plate, but it can be helpful if you can identify that red. Alberta also does not use front plates. Finally, for this province, we have the provincial road, which just says Alberta at the top. It's hard to miss, pretty easy to get. So the next province on the list is Saskatchewan. So again, Saskatchewan is part of the Great Plains and therefore is extremely flat. This is honestly one of the more hilly locations, as you can see by a little bit of a hill here, but generally it is just extremely flat. Probably the single most useful tip for Saskatchewan is the insulator setup on the power poles. In case you're unaware, the insulator is this little piece up here at the top of the pole. So as we can see on this pole, there is one insulator on the left side and two on the right side. If we look at the next pole, we have two insulators on the left side and one on the right side. These alternate. So again, one on the left, two on the right. This next one's kind of a cross one, so it's not super helpful, but I think you get the point. You can also see it on the left side. Two on the left, one on the right. The next one has one on the left, two on the right, and they alternate all the way down. This is extremely helpful, especially if you're in, again, a very country road, playing no move and have really no other way of determining where you are. Seeing these poles and seeing their insulators swapping back and forth left and right is extremely helpful for Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan also features these triangles on their poles. Not much more to it. You do see them pretty often, in this case a stop sign. I believe some other signs do have them, but for a road like this, there's basically no other signs. So if you see these triangles on the side of a signpost, you're probably in Saskatchewan. Next, we have the license plate. Again, Saskatchewan is not a front plate using province. And as you can see here, there's kind of a green blur where the license plate is. This is backed up by the license plate itself, which is green text on a white background. Green blur, probably Saskatchewan. And finally, here's the province road for Saskatchewan. With this type of blur, I always think of these as little mushrooms. They're supposed to be bundles of wheat, but without the distinction, they just look like mushrooms. So if I see the mushroom sign, I know I'm in Saskatchewan. The next province is Manitoba. And honestly, Manitoba is one of the harder provinces just because there isn't too much that's unique to it. So we have these stripy poles. In a little bit of a difference to Saskatchewan's triangles, Manitoba features the stripes. Manitoba also features this type of bollard, which has a black top and an orange stripe on it. You may also see this sometimes without the orange stripe. Manitoba bollards are not as common as other provinces' bollards, but they are still pretty helpful. Manitoba might have the easiest plate to identify. You can see these green blurs on either side of the license plate. Again, this is one of the provinces that does use a front plate. Here is the unblurred license plate. Again, these trees on the left and right side make up that green blur on both sides of the license plate. So it is pretty easy to identify. Province-specific roads come in a couple types. For example, this one that says Manitoba with the road number in black, as well as this one that also says Manitoba with the road number in a pentagon. Both of these say Manitoba, so it should be pretty easy to figure out where you are based on that. Manitoba is also partially in the Great Plains, so you may see some similar landscapes to what we were looking at earlier in Saskatchewan and that one part of Alberta, but you can also get forests kind of like this one in the central and eastern parts of the province. The general vibe of at least most of Ontario is pretty similar to the United States. This is because a lot of the latitude that is covered by Ontario is also shared with the US. So for example, something like this personally reminds me of somewhere like Wisconsin or maybe parts of Michigan, just because they are on a similar latitude, so you'll get similar weather and tree growth and things like that. Some tips for Ontario include the kilometers per hour, specifically on a black background. So remember back all the way in British Columbia when I mentioned that if it's on a white background it's there? That's because this one also exists in Ontario with a black background. Again, this is not present in every single Ontario speed sign, but if you do see this, you will be in Ontario. Next, you'll see these diamond signs, typically green and white, possibly could be other colors, but I wasn't able to find any. There are some with green on top and white on bottom, or ones like this one with white on top and green on the bottom. Often you'll see these on the ends of guardrails, such as this one here, and if you look all the way at the end, there's a little speck of one down there. Also on some other signs on the side of the road. But these diamond signs are unique to Ontario. Power poles are actually really useful in Canada. The provinces were able to agree on basically one style per province, unlike the US, which we'll get into next episode, which you can't trust power poles almost ever. Ontario power poles have these two extendy bits basically on either side. There could be multiple per pole, there could be just one, but if you see this, they're slightly angled up as well. If you see this, you are generally going to be in Ontario. Ontario is also one of the provinces that uses a front license plate. As you can see here, there's kind of a blue blur on a white background. This makes sense because the license plate is blue text on a white background. There is also apparently a fully blue license plate with white text. However, I found that this was discontinued about a month after it was released, just due to visibility concerns, so you should never see it. If you do, it's very rare, but if you do see an all-blue license plate, you will be in Ontario as well. Finally, here's the province-specific road sign for Ontario. It is basically an outline of a crown with the number in it. Ontario does like their crown insignias, so generally if you do see a crown on a road sign or something, you should be in Ontario. On to Quebec. The general vibe of Quebec kind of varies just because it's a pretty wide province, but for something like this, which is found in the southeastern bit of Quebec, it looks like the northeast United States. There are some obvious things that make it not the United States, which we'll get into, but just the house type and kind of just the general feel of the area makes me think maybe Maine or Rhode Island or Massachusetts or something like that. Because the primary language of Quebec is French, all of the signs that would normally say street instead say rue, which is street in French. Another instance of French being seen on a sign that typically isn't is secteur in the speed signs. This is seen much less often and is mostly just seen in cities, but it is still a pretty good indication that you're in Quebec. Probably the easiest indication of Quebec is arrêt on the stop signs instead of the word stop. This can be seen only in Quebec. There is a bilingual sign, which we'll get into later in New Brunswick, but obviously if it doesn't say stop, you're not going to be anywhere else but Quebec. So as I mentioned earlier, Quebec differs from the norm of the rest of Canada and uses these white on red chevrons. So normally Canada has black on yellow. Quebec is a little bit different and has white on red. Again, differing from the norm, Quebec does not use the checkerboard pattern at their T-junction signs, instead just opting for a black and yellow sign with the arrows. Quebec's bollards, so to speak, are these posts that are always seen specifically on guardrails like this one. They extend fairly high up and can have a red or green indicator here. This is especially helpful in northern Quebec, especially when there's literally nothing and it feels like you were in the middle of a river. Seeing these on the guardrails lets you know you're in Quebec. Next we have the power poles. So the insulator configuration for Quebec is these two small arms that extend from either side to carry the insulator. As you can see as well here, the transformer is parallel to the street, as opposed to the one that was perpendicular in British Columbia and as we'll soon see in New Brunswick. These yellow stickers can be seen on power poles in Quebec as well. They have a little Q on the top, and I believe the set of letters and numbers are indicative of the location of the power pole. I'm not entirely sure, especially because this one here has two different sets of letters and numbers, but I'm sure someone's done the research, and if I find a good guide for that, I'll put that in the description. This is probably the best example of a license plate that I can see, which is interesting because, as we'll see, the Quebec license plate is a pretty dark blue on a white background. So like the Ontario one, I feel like we should be able to see it, but in this case, and a lot of other cases that I've seen, you really can't. So this is what the license plate looked like unblurred versus blurred. There's really not much there. Quebec is also a province that does not use the front plate. And finally, for Quebec is the province-specific road. You can see at the top, we have 3 fleur-de-lis, as well as the road sign in green. The fleur-de-lis is very popular in French culture. That's why you see it a lot in New Orleans as well. So I'm not very surprised that it shows up in Quebec. Next up is New Brunswick, and as I mentioned earlier, New Brunswick stop signs have both the word stop and arrêt on them, which is interesting because I believe this is the only bilingual English-French signs that you'll be able to find in the country. There are some very, very specific bilingual English and native languages that you may see in places like Nunavut, but only English and French you'll find in New Brunswick. I found this while researching myself, so it hasn't been rigorously tested. I found that these poles being covered in this black and yellow stripage, I guess, is pretty specific to New Brunswick. Again, this could be found elsewhere, but I've really only seen it here. Also, because New Brunswick uses French as an official language, we see things like rue and also chemin in street signs. In this case, this one is bilingual. As mentioned earlier, New Brunswick is one of only 2 provinces that have their transformers facing the road. As we can see, it is directly perpendicular to the road and facing us when we pass by. This is a blurred New Brunswick license plate. You can kind of see red text on a white background, which makes sense because that is what the plate is. There is also a bit of blue up top here, but that's really not visible in the blur. As mentioned earlier, New Brunswick used to require front plates, but no longer does. The location that I'm looking at here is from 2019, which is when they made the change, so we can see front plates here. But in new coverage, especially that taken within the past year or two, you are likely not going to have front plates. Finally, for New Brunswick, we have the province-specific road. It is the shape of New Brunswick with the letters NB on top with the road number underneath. The road sign is pretty simple and easy to get. In this case, it also features bilingual English and French. Moving on to Prince Edward Island. This is by far the smallest province in Canada. The general vibe and the reason why a lot of people are able to get this province is because it has a reddish feel. So if you look around, the road is sort of red tinted, the dirt is a little red tinted. Based on this, generally New Brunswick near PEI or PEI itself is the right play. Because the province is so small, there aren't really many things to go off of here. The main one is this white sticker that can be found on power poles. This is very helpful and can be seen on just about all power poles in the province and is a very good indicator of being here. License plates in PEI are relatively hard to identify. So looking at this white car here, you can kind of see a bit of a smudge on the left side of where the plate is and just regular white on the rest. This corresponds to this license plate, which has the province's parliamentary house on the left side, which would line up with that little blob that we were seeing on the left side of the plate. Black text and white elsewhere. That one was used until 2022, in which case this one became the new license plate. I don't know if there's any new coverage from 2022 or more recent on the island. If there was, I would expect this license plate to look more like the Saskatchewan one, with a relatively green blur. Finally, for PEI, we have the province-specific road. In this case, there's a little bit of a forest on top in green with the road number underneath. This one is also bilingual English and French, which is interesting because I do not believe that French is an official language of the island. But again, it is a federal language, so this makes sense. The next province we're looking at is Nova Scotia. So Nova Scotia, again, kind of looks like the northeastern United States. The main feature of Nova Scotia, as kind of alluded to earlier, is the transformer. It's kind of hard to see, and it is kind of hard to see in games, but the transformer is not perpendicular nor parallel to the road. It is at a 45-degree angle, so as you can see, we're kind of looking at the power pole at an angle, and the transformer goes along with it. This is kind of hard to tell, especially in a no moving game, because sometimes, such as maybe this one, the transformer looks perpendicular like you would see in New Brunswick. You really need to either get a feel of what this transformer looks like on a pole, or just get underneath it if you're able to properly see the angle. Next is the license plate. This one is also incredibly easy to distinguish. There is a big blue blur on the bottom, as we can see with the unblurred plate. It is basically all blue, which makes sense with the blurred plate. Nova Scotia also does not use front plates. For province roads, Nova Scotia features this one, which is a blue cross on a white background with, in the middle, what is actually the Royal Arms of Scotland, with the road number in white on a blue background. The other type is actually basically identical to the US Highway Shield. This is distinct to Nova Scotia. So the final province that we're looking at is Newfoundland and Labrador. So Newfoundland refers to this island off of the coast of Canada, and Labrador refers to this big mainland section. There is significantly more coverage and people on the island of Newfoundland than Labrador, but there is still coverage in Labrador. It's kind of hard to put into words, but Newfoundland kind of has a look to it. Generally, it is very hilly, specifically not mountainous like you would see in British Columbia. There are a ton of trees, a lot of birch trees, almost looks Scandinavian if you're familiar with how that looks. But generally, just kind of by the vibe and the look to these forests and hills, you can determine that you're in Newfoundland. One of the easier clues in Newfoundland, specifically in the more urban areas, are these octagonal trash cans or bins that can be seen in the front of houses. These are pretty much only found here and are very common in urban areas. Newfoundland also features a different T-junction sign. It has the traditional diamond checkerboard sign in the middle, but is on a rectangular background with extra arrows on either side of it. License plates in Newfoundland are again blue text on a white background, somewhat visible here, a little bit more on this car in the middle. This is the unblurred plate. Compared to the blurred plate, generally just another blue text on a white background license plate. Newfoundland does not use the front plate. Province roads in Newfoundland include this very generic looking numbers in a white box, as well as this trapezoid looking one. This is actually Route 391, but the one is kind of burned off or something. I don't really know what happened, but this is a Newfoundland province road sign. Finally, the coverage in Labrador that I promised you. This is the Trans-Labrador Highway, which is relatively distinct for being Gen 4, very, very sunny coverage, and also some snow on the side of the road. Otherwise, it's just a pretty long road with a lot of trees, looks pretty nice, and is in Labrador. So I did say that Newfoundland was the last province that we were covering, but we do have 3 more territories to go through. The first is the Yukon Territory. Because the Yukon Territory is also part of the Rocky Mountains, it has a pretty hilly, or in some cases mountainous landscape to it. In the northern part of the province, you have an extremely barren landscape. This one kind of looks like it was a victim of a forest fire, but I don't believe all of it looks like that. You will also see Gen 2 pretty frequently up here in the northern part of Canada, especially in the Yukon Territory. There is Gen 4 as well, but I believe that is limited to the southern half of the province. I don't know for sure, but you will never see Gen 3 in the Yukon Territory. Going back to coverage, there are very few people that live in the territory, so there are very few roads and therefore very little coverage. For what roads there is pretty good coverage on them. So we have this main road that goes into the Northwestern Territories, this road that goes into Alaska, and some interfacing with British Columbia as well. The Yukon Territory license plate is relatively identifiable due to this blue bar on the bottom of the plate. So here is the license plate unblurred. As you can see, the very blue bar on the bottom part of the plate, as well as this orange on the left side, which sometimes you're able to see. In this case, not as much. If you're really looking for it, you can make it out, but generally the blue bar on the bottom is your best bet. The province road for the Yukon Territory is extremely simple. The roads only go, I believe, 1 to 6. There may be a couple more, but I believe they're all single digit. This one is in a red box. I believe, again, they can come in green or red, but it is just a single digit in a box. We'll start looking at the Northwest Territories with the actual coverage of it. There is extremely limited coverage. So as we can see, there is this road that leads up from the Yukon Territory up to Nunavut. There are also a couple of roads that lead up from Alberta and Saskatchewan, kind of converging up in Yellowknife, which is the capital of the territory as well. Pretty much any urban coverage that is in the Northwest Territories will be in Yellowknife, as that has the most people. Though, as you can see here, there is some in Inuvik as well. Again, because the coverage is very limited, the Google car hasn't really come up here too much, so you will see a lot of Gen 2 coverage. Looking at the license plate, it's kind of hard to make out, again, because of Gen 2, but you might be able to tell that that's not a traditional rectangular license plate. That is because the Northwest Territories has the single best license plate in possibly the world. It is the shape of a polar bear. It's just a polar bear. Like, if you can tell that this isn't a normal rectangle, you're probably going to be in Yellowknife or Inuvik, or sometimes in Nunavut, which we'll get to later, but it's a polar bear. I mean, come on. Northwest Territories also does not have the front plate. The Northwest Territories also have their own distinct bollard. Like the Alberta one, it is 2 bands of black, but the Northwest Territories ones has a smaller strip of white in between the bands of black. It's kind of hard to distinguish, but I think generally you'll have a good idea of where you are. Sometimes there is that Northwest Territories, Alberta, extremely northern 50-50. So if you're going for a province streak, make sure you know this one, but otherwise they are very similar. Finally, there is the province-specific road sign. This was very hard to find, so you'll probably not see it too often, but it has the letters NWT with a polar bear on top and the highway number underneath it. So the final territory that we are looking at in Canada is Nunavut. So there are about 5 or 6 areas of relevance in this territory. The first is Iqaluit. The way to determine Iqaluit is the snowy coverage that you can see all around here, as well as this bilingual stop sign. This stop sign is both in English and the native language of Inuktitut, which is very interesting. There's really nothing like it in the world, I guess. You don't really see a language that looks like this or even a bilingual stop sign that looks like this, so very cool. Otherwise, Iqaluit is, again, the snowy coverage. It looks relatively populated compared to some of the other ones that we'll be looking at, and is covered in Gen 3. As I mentioned earlier, the kilometers per hour on the speed sign being on a white background underneath a number, it should be exclusive to British Columbia. However, it can be found here as well, though with everything else nearby, you should be able to distinguish the two. Nunavut also uses the polar bear plate, as you can see here. However, this one was discontinued in 2012. This coverage is from 2013. I don't believe there's any newer coverage, but the new license plate looks like this. It is also very cool. I have one myself. I highly recommend it. Up next is the town of Grise Fiord. I will show where all of these towns are afterward. The main identification for Grise Fiord is these huge mountains in the back of the town, effectively, featuring these ice flows down them. This looks a lot like Greenland. Honestly, you kind of just have to know that this exists to distinguish it from Greenland, or I guess see this Canadian flag here. But otherwise, this is very similar to what you would see in northern Greenland. Up next is Resolute, which again kind of looks like Grise Fiord, except the hills or mountains are significantly less. There is still snow on these hills, but the distinctiveness of the Grise Fiord Mountains should set it apart from Resolute here. The next town covered is Cambridge Bay. This one is pretty identifiable due to being covered in Gen 2 coverage. It also looks very, very northern, and again, it might be confused with Greenland a bit, but mostly due to the lack of snow and mountains, you should be able to nail this down to Canada. So the next town we're looking at is Qikiqtarjuaq. This can be identified by the reddish dirt that can be seen around. There are also these green mounds or just big hills that can be seen behind the town as well. I would say that this one looks less like Greenland than the previous couple, but still you can tell it's very, very northern, and there's also a shadow of a trekker here that you can sometimes see. So this last one is not a town, but is a location that can come up in maps like A Community World. This is because this is the northernmost trekker coverage in the world. This is effectively the North Pole, as the North Pole doesn't have actual land to cover, so this is used instead. I have gotten this location in a game once, and I vaguely knew where it was, so was able to get pretty good points on it. It is identifiable by just being a large sheet of glacier, effectively. There's nothing around, this is a non-pinpointable location, but it does come up because it is in a majority of maps. The reason why it is in a majority of maps is to extend the boundaries of the map. So, as I mentioned in my previous video about the introduction to GeoGuessr, the range to get a 5K is determined by the boundaries of the map. By having the boundaries be as wide as possible, the 5K distance is as wide as possible, and it becomes a true world map. So, where even are these towns and locations? I've put a pin on each town here. So, the bottom-most one is Iqaluit. The one slightly northeast of that is Qikiqtarjuaq, which can be seen here, probably the closest one to Greenland. Cambridge Bay can be found in this region. Resolute can be found on one of these middle islands here. Grise Fiord, which I believe is one of the most northern settlements in the world, can be found up here. And finally, the North Pole location can be found slightly north of the label of Tankery Camp in this little circular section. The circular section is visible on GeoGuessr if you ever get the location, so it technically is 5Kable if you know exactly where you're going, but it is not made to be pinpointable. Some final tips for Canada. The waste bins or trash cans can generally be helpful. Compared to the United States, where a lot of trash cans are owned by a company, a lot of trash cans in Canada, as you can see here, is owned by the city and have the city name on it. This is also more relevant in countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Great Britain. Maybe it's the British influence, I don't know, but looking at trash cans sometimes will be very helpful. One final thing is the presence of wooden poles. So this is not exclusive to Canada, as you can see this in the northern United States a lot, but this stop sign is on a plank of wood as opposed to a corrugated metal like you would see in the United States. Again, this is not exclusive to Canada, but it is very, very common here. So if you stuck with the video for this long, you clearly have an interest in learning Canada, and I thank you for that. What are the next steps, you might be wondering? I would say the first steps include learning the major cities in each province. So for example, Alberta has Edmonton, Calgary, Red Deer, even some as small as Medicine Hat might be useful, because a lot of the time you'll see distance markers on highways that show you how far you are from a city, and knowing where that city is extremely helpful. This is relevant for basically every country in the world, but it's always good to start here. The next thing I would look at is getting a handle on Alberta's range and township roads, just having a good idea of at least where the major cities are in relation to the number of the townships roads. So in my example earlier, I used 250, which is basically on the same latitude line as Calgary, so knowing that and seeing that in a game can narrow it down even faster. Another step, and possibly one of the more extreme steps if you really, really want to learn the country, is learning phone codes. Canada uses a 3-digit phone code, much like the US, and there are a lot of them within the country. In this image, which is in the Comprehensive Canada document, which I'll talk about in just a little bit, the bolded ones are the primary one that you'll find in the province, which can also be found in their major cities, whereas the ones that are not bold can also be found there, just less common. It is probably still good, even if you're not going to learn all of them, to learn maybe one or two, maybe 807 for this section of Ontario, 867 for all the territories, though those should be more identifiable anyways, or something like 416 for Toronto to distinguish it from Vancouver if you're just in the middle of the city or something. Those might prove very helpful. So, some final resources to go to after you finish watching this video. The first, as I just alluded to, is the Comprehensive Canada document. It is literally 500 pages, I guess depending on your zoom level, that goes through everything I went through and then a lot more. I believe there's about 100 pages dedicated to the Yukon Territory roads and towns alone. This was made by Davis Savage and is currently being redone. There hasn't been an update since February. It is currently September, so I don't really know about when that'll be done, though this current version has some missing and inaccurate info, but a lot of it is still extremely good to use. There's also, of course, the Plunkett Guide, which I will probably end up recommending for every single country that I go through. This is an extremely good guide. Again, it features a lot of what I talked about today, but also a couple more things, as well as some very specific towns that are covered. There are some more in the upper island part of the country that I didn't cover that are officially part of Quebec or are trekkers like that. And these are mentioned here with some tips on how to identify them. And finally, a good way to practice the country is this map. It is A Balanced Canada by /P. There are just under 65,000 locations spread across all of Canada, every single province, every single territory. Not necessarily pinpointable, I don't think, but it is very, very good for province guessing and just getting a general idea of what provinces look like and what other parts of provinces really. So northern Alberta and northern Saskatchewan look kind of different from the rest of it. So getting an idea of what those look like and putting your skills to the test is always a great learning method. So that is it for Canada. If I missed anything obvious or if I said things that are inaccurate, please let me know in the comments so I can make a revision if necessary. If you liked watching, please leave a like and subscribe for the rest of the series. Up next is the United States. So that is going to be a pretty big one, probably about as long as this one, if not longer. So that should be a fun one to do. Thanks for watching as always, and I will see you soon.